try and abbreviate as best I can. First of all, many thanks to both of the Alexes for allowing me to come and say a few words. At some point, I'd written to them and said, it's like, interesting buzz in the Cheminformatics sphere about this new international ISO 11238 standard that might make an interesting talk, to tack somewhere into the ChemAxon user group meeting. And so to introduce it, I knew nothing about it myself 6 months ago. And Richard Bolton from GSK said, have you heard about the buzz and the flurry of information about 11238? The regulatory folks and our IT compliance people are beginning to sweat a teeny bit about this. And so it turns out that 11238 is a document produced by the UN and various standards organizations on health informatics, identification of medicinal products, data elements and structures for unique identification and exchange of regulated informational substances. That effectively the legal community has decided to take a position on SMILE strings versus InChI keys versus MOL files, and in an attempt to try and allow the exchange of information between the FDA and pharma companies and health services and healthcare providers is to define identifiers and connection table standards for exchanging information between folks, such that aspirin versus Tylenol versus paracetamol versus what have you can be distinguished or identified as equivalents in each form. So it defines a framework for uniquely identifying and exchanging compounds of pharmaceutical interest. And essentially, it provides a framework very similar to CAS registry numbers, PubChem IDs, or InChI keys. At some point later in the talk, I shall explain why the talk I'm giving is not the same as the abstract I thought I would give, but it's interesting how things advance further forward. It turns out that 11238 is one of a suite of 5 related standards that the IDMP, the Identification of Medicinal Products, family of standards. 238 is on the actual substances. 239 is on dose forms and administration. 240 is on units of measurement so that the sizes of dose forms can be regulated. And then pharmaceutical product information, medicinal information. So they nest like Matryoshka dolls relating to each other. And of course, why this is important is it turns out that not only has this standard appeared without much input from the pharmaceutical or cheminformatics side of the pharmaceutical industry. It turns out this was proposed in 2010 and 2011, voted on and read into as an international standard in 2012, and then subsequently has been read in and written into European Union law. It turns out that all adverse events and filings between FDA and medical associations in the European Union, pharmacovigilance, are required to use this method for trying to determine whether compounds are the same or whether they're different by the 1st of July 2016. So essentially, effectively it has passed us by and is now a requirement imposed from above. And of course everyone's now saying, well what's in it? What's it all about? And so it turns out, reading through it, this is where I have to apologize ever so slightly, is that the original draft of these documents described a large number of rules were based on the Food and Drug Administration's SRS guidelines. In 2007, the internal registry system, the Food and Drug Administration, proposed an interesting set of standards and way of storing chemical structures inside their registration system, which way azides should be represented, which way nitros should be drawn. And of course, one would naturally assume that you could then develop a set of ChemAxon standardizer rules matching those FDA proposals and guidelines. It turns out that although, IMI, OpenFacts, and various bodies have then selected those guidelines and rules as a way of transferring information between themselves, it turns out that although the body of that text was used to form the ISO 11238 standard, it then mysteriously fizzed into 2 parts. The actual technical details of what makes one compound similar to another or why they're different was pushed into an annex or is still waiting to be developed and ratified. But the main core of it essentially defines a workflow for introducing a replacement for CAS numbers. So in the very general sense, I'm very supportive of 11238. Up till now, every time you wanted to file something, you had to pay the chemical abstract service to assign you a number. And every time you wanted to look it up, you'd have to pay chemical abstract service to look up the number. And so, of course, the fact that people out there are now trying to introduce alternate numbering and naming schemes is useful. And so the way that they propose it working is to have names and identifiers or connection tables that you then submit to a regulatory authority. They haven't said which one. That will then return you back a unique code by which you can refer to a compound. And then likewise, with the code for a compound, you can, again, approach the same regulatory authority and get back a lot of information. So effectively, it is solving the task of assigning IDs to compounds. And this was then the point that Richard Bolton was making, is effectively, it seems to be a strange sort of evolution as registration as a service, that there is somebody out there that will assign numbers to your compounds, and that you're then forced or required to use them. It turns out from the wording of the standard that I think someone mentioned previously with RFIs and RFPs, that they have a vendor or a plan in mind whenever these documents are written. And so it looks like the proposed or primary regulatory authority is likely to be the Food and Drug Administration in the United States and one of the National Institutes of Health sets of tools for supporting it. And the identifier they're proposing or looks to be mandated is the Food and Drug Administration Unicode as a form of UNNI. XML, various file formats coming in. It turns out that chemically significant text being an important part to distinguish the different forms for things that aren't captured by the connection table. So, of course, the current status, looking back at this as well, what's happening, how are things going on, is the standard has been ratified and its use has been written into EU law. The framework requires the use of non-semantic, random, fixed-length unique identifiers that include an internal integrity check. And the standard also details constraints on uniqueness, what it is that makes one sequence the same as another, why it is that one molecule can be similar. But the strange thing is the exact implementation details are yet to be determined, and we'll hear in a future implementation guide. And this is one of the interesting Heisenberg effects, is that I'd submitted my abstract to this meeting, the ChemAxon meeting, saying it's like, they're about to ratify a terrible standard. I immediately get bombarded as soon as the ChemAxon, a program and registration thing goes online by a large number of emails from the various people that have been doing this, and they've decided to stall their ratification of the late implementation guide. So it's one of those strange things. By warning about it early, I'm now talking about a problem that might never come to pass, thanks to the availability or the talk here at the meeting. But this is essentially what the future will look like. ISO 11238 compliant identifiers will be very similar to the FDA's unique ingredient identifier. Fixed-length non-semantic identifier, which rules out the use of SMILE's InChI version 2000 Mol file and symbol file encodings. So when exchanging things, the existing file formats aren't sufficient. And likewise, one of the things they're trying to do is compound registration numbers, Chembl IDs, PubChem CIDs, tend to be assigned sequentially. You have a notion of chronology. Lower numbers would have been defined longer ago. And one of the things that's been introduced as part of this standard, or now mandated, is they need to be assigned in random order. You shouldn't be able to work out which compound has priority over another compound based on the numerical sequence. But that then also rules out a number of other IDs. But it turns out that one possible alternative is to take InChI keys or canonical SMILEs, and with chemically relevant text, hash them into something of the relevant format. What's available now is that, alas, ISO charges for official access to the standard. So having found out about it, you have this problem of, how do you get your hands on it and read what's written into there? One of my funny comments is that if they charge for each one, it explains why there are 5 standards rather than 1. And then mysteriously is that from different places on the internet, the prices range from as cheap as $120 to as expensive as $340. I suspect, if you buy it from Denmark or Norway, it is cheaper than buying it from the British Standards Organization or the US ANSI. It turns out the exactly same wording is used in different places. But the thing that had caught me out is that, as with many ISO standards, is that late drafts, a bit like IUPAC, recommendations and guidelines, are available free on the internet. But there are a huge number of changes, or significant technical changes, between the versions you can get your hands on versus the versions you pay for. And so lots of the rest of my talk is based on what I could get for free that has then mysteriously disappeared from the final wording. So essentially the problem of all those technical parts and annexes have been moved into the implementation guide that is yet to appear or be written. So, for example, one of the example requirements of the ISO 11238 states that whenever you submit a compound for naming by these authorities, you have to have at least one name associated with it. Now, it can be a company code or internal number. But of course, I mean, for the envisaged workflows, this assumes INN or USAN names have already been registered. So again, at the late stage regulatory, for their registration as a service, they assume that someone already knows what the name is going to be. Interestingly, one way to guarantee the existence of a suitable name is to use tools such as IUPAC naming tools and provide an arbitrary identifier to any of the compounds you have of interest. And this is where I put a tiny plug-in for the great work of Daniel B. and the ChemAxon tools, who have the state-of-the-art in compound naming. The coverage of ChemAxon structure to name is far higher than anything else out there. But the devil is in the details, as they say. And one of the interesting cheminformatics challenges with working with the ISO standard is it's very poorly written. It was put together by lawyers and bureaucrats that knew nothing about the chemistry, and there's a huge number of cut and paste and typographical errors. And so it's interesting. I'll start showing some of these. So the final ISO 11238 standard, as written into law, now contains examples of small strings with strong use of spaces between characters, such as equals and what have you, creating no end of problems for cheminformatics programs that then have to go and strip out the spaces. Likewise, the InChI examples, they strip out the InChI equals prefix. Steve Heller and the InChI Trust are very unhappy that the text as transferred isn't an InChI as they would recognize it. And then, as I explained on the last file, on the next slide, the MOL file fails to mention that version 2000 MOL files use fixed width columns and blank lines as part of the way they store things. And so, essentially, all of the examples, in the official standards, have missing blank lines where you'd expect, comments, names to be, and incorrectly aligned columns that essentially shuffle the numbers around and mean numbers and prefixes. Of course, this then creates, a marvelous challenge that a new form of MOL files is on about. So, of course, the question is that perhaps these were unintentional last-minute changes or caused by problems in fonts. Clearly, missing InChI equals from the start of an InChI string can't be a typographical error, but it turns out that the technical details, all of the things that were in the late draft that were pulled out at the last moment and were waiting to see what the final form are, show that these problems are far more deep-rooted, that the people putting the standard together. So here, for example, is then from the previous draft, not only the missing InChI, the use of 1 versus 1s, of whether you're standard or non-standard InChI, all of the element symbols converted to uppercase, so CL here and AL. Of course, for the last 100 years, IUPAC chemists have been more than happy to have atomic symbols are upper and lowercase. We now have the indication that zircon now has to be uppercase. Likewise, line breaks, hyphenation, indentation, and stereo spaces. The task of, if someone sends you this XML, could you get the structure back out again, is becoming harder and harder. And then this is my classic, my favorite classic from the entire document. Those people that have ever worked in the field of cheminformatics realize that this has become line noise. If this is how, cheminformatics systems are supposed to exchange things, we're on course for another healthcare.gov. However, this is then where I step up and realize, this just creates a bigger and more significant challenge. And so back at the 2011 ChemAxon UGM here in Budapest, Sayle Murison from AstraZeneca gave a presentation on how using spelling correction can be used to improve the recall of a name-to-structure tool. So when you're doing text mining, if you can fix OCR mistakes and common typos, you can recover things. So in an abuse of the same technology, the method used for performing spelling correction of IUPAC names can actually be used to perform spelling correction on smile strings, InChI keys, and version 2000 MOL files. And as with IUPAC-like systematic names, each of these can be specified by a formal grammar and then transformed into with a specification of what it is to be correct, you can work out what the minimum number of edits is to turn a string into something that's valid. It turns out for a version 2000 MOL file, we can produce an interesting state machine with 1,333 states. And if you're the only allowed corrections you allow in spelling correction are the deletion of new lines and the insertion of spaces or new lines, as permitted in syntax, it is possible to write a piece of software that takes the line noise, the digit soup that we saw previously, and to turn something into far more interesting. So here, for example, how to create cows from hamburgers. You can take the text of said documents and turn it back into something that ChemDraw and ChemAxon Marvin can read. Interestingly, I wouldn't be here if there wasn't something in it for the audience. It turns out the source code or how to do this has been contributed and is now posted on the ChemAxon forum. And of course, the code as you would use within the toolkit is try reading the mol file as you would anyway. But if that fails, try fixing it using spelling correction, such that if the returned string after spelling correction, you may have a better hope with. One tiny technical detail. I apologize. I normally fill the Geek of the Week slot at most conferences I speak at by presenting some obscure technical case. It turns out the people that use Pipeline Pilot are even more challenging than the rest of the world. It turns out Pipeline Pilot abbreviates mol files by only writing out a subset of the zeros in the atom column. And it turns out this then leads rise to potential ambiguity, where the last atom line may actually be pulled into the bond line. We have cakes and coffee coming up, so I shall skip the technicality there. Finally, another interesting aspect of that is also then the what about the InChIs that we saw previously, the conversion to uppercase and scripting things. Is exactly the same spelling correction can be applied to that. The code is also on the forum. But essentially, the problem here is that they've lost information now. It's a lossy process. If you take an InChI key and convert it to uppercase, it's impossible to get back what the original is. So a good example is given the string CSN, all in uppercase. Was it carbon, sulfur, nitrogen, cesium, nitrogen, or carbon, tin? Of course, one can apply the spelling correction, such that you can fix the InChI equals, work out that the L here must be lowercase, the C there must be lowercase. All of these H's are allowed to be uppercase, but this H over here is lowercase. And so we then did an analysis, a bit of data mining to work out, well, how bad is the problem if we start exchanging these things as uppercase InChIs? So you can take 1.35 million standard InChIs from Chembl, convert them to uppercase, try and spelling correct them, and then work out how many come back again. And it turns out the problems aren't particularly widespread. 99.5% of compounds round trip, 6,000 discrepancies, 6,500 discrepancies. The biggest problem is essentially the hydrobromide salts. Lots of compounds out there have HBr written on the end. And when you convert things to uppercase, a program has great difficulty trying to work out, did you mean boron rhenium or bromine hydrogen? It turns out these first two cases, it's almost entire, the hydrobromide or the bromofluoride that is, so these can be disambiguated almost entirely from context, leaving a total of 22 cases that you can't actually round trip in real life. So the conclusions are that the Java source code for recovering version 2000 mol files from InChIs from the types of corruption seen in the ISO 11238 draft have now been contributed to the ChemAxon forum, allowing Marvin and JChem to read examples given in that document. Whether this functionality will actually be required in the final pending implementation guide remains to be seen. Most of the advantage of pointing out these problems is that people are fortunately getting a chance to fix them before they're imposed further on the world. But of course, the important bit at the end is that attention really needs to be paid to details, and the pharmaceutical industry and its experts really needs to apply more input to some of these legal and decision-making processes. Final words, my pun of the week is that it's likely in the not too far distant future that ISO 11238 IDs may become as popular as ChemAbstract's registry numbers, both in both wordings of the pun popular. And then finally, I'd like to acknowledge the various people that have been in touch and helped me with put this together as soon as